Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Dr. Adrienne Dixon, the Executive Director of the Education and Civil Rights Initiative. This is our webinar series, monthly webinar series. And the title of this this session today is called The Price of Opportunity. And we're very excited to have our guests here to have a very lively conversation and presentation talking about opportunity and from a number of perspectives. I think most of our panelists, at least three of them, and I'll share in their bios, have been engaged in education law, both as a practice and as a scholarly focus. So we're happy to have them here. We hold our series on Thursdays from 6 to 7:30 monthly. So let me quickly tell you about the Educational Civil Rights Initiative here at the University of Kentucky and the College of Education. Our mission is to work collaboratively with appropriate partners to ensure that education is a civil right through education, research, community partnerships, and innovative and responsive scholarship. Our vision is that we envision a society that affirms the immutable characteristics and intersectional identities of all people, including but not limited to those who identify as or are members of African American, Black, Latinx, Asian, American, Pacific Islander, First Nations, and Indigenous, LGBTQI+, diversely abled, first generation, and immigrant communities. So I'm going to introduce our panel. And they are joining us from the National Education Policy Center. They each hold individual appointments at other institutions. So our first panelist will be Chris Saldaña. He is an assistant professor and Anna Julia Cooper Fellow in the Department of Education Leadership and Policy Analysis in the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research examines the relationship between K-12, school finance policy, practice, and politics, and educational opportunity, with a particular focus on the educational opportunity of historically marginalized students. He holds a bachelor's degree and master's degree in economics from the University of California, San Diego, and Cal State University, Fullerton, respectively, and a PhD in educational foundations, policy, and practice from the University of Colorado Boulder. Welcome, Chris. We have John Myers. He began his work in education policy as a state legislator, a community education coordinator, and a governor's policy director and education program director for the National Conference of State Legislatures. As a consultant, Myers has worked with state policymakers in all 50 states on a broad range of education policy issues. His expertise is in school finance equity and adequacy, state school funding formulas, charter school authorization, and teacher quality issues. He is a former partner in the Denver-based firm of Oglenbick, Myers, Oglenblick, Palick, and Associates. Myers is a fellow at the National Education Policy Center and is a consultant on the Price of Opportunity project. We also have Regina Umpstead. She's a professor at the University of Louisville, right down the road. Her interests include various education law and policy topics related to systemic issues such as school finance and also diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. She received a JD from the University of Michigan Law School and a PhD from Michigan State University in Ed Policy. She is the author of many journal articles and 2 books, Avoiding Special Education Litigation and Professional Responsibility for Educators and the Michigan Code of Ethics. And we have Kate Somerville. She is a doctoral student and in the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. She holds an MA in teaching from Johns Hopkins and a BA in Public Policy Studies and Political Science from St. Mary's College of Maryland. Prior to starting at CU Boulder, Kate taught 2nd grade in Baltimore City. Her research interests surround youth-engaged education policy related to police-free schools and school-based systems of healing, wellness, and mental health. And we, again, are so honored to have you all here. And Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. It's always the hardest part of the Zoom to figure out how to unmute once you've shared your screen. So can you all see the slides? Does it look okay? Perfect. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Dixon, for the introduction. I just want to say thank you first to you and Dr. Sarah LaCour Yarbrough for inviting us to be a part of the webinar, and to Mariama for helping us get all of this organized so we can be here with you today. And also thank you to the University of Kentucky College of Education and the Education and Civil Rights Initiative for putting this webinar on. So today we're presenting a project conducted by the National Education Policy Center entitled The Price of Opportunity Project. And what we're presenting today is just one slice of that work. It's a pretty huge project. But today is what we're presenting is the school-focused part of that work, and what we're calling rethinking how we cost out K-12 school funding. We'll present a general overview of the entire project at the end of the presentation, but so that we don't overload you with too much information at the very beginning, we're going to hold off on that. So there's an incentive to stick around till the very end. Okay, let's see. Oh, all right. So I want to highlight that this project is a collaborative research project. So these are all of the names of the individuals who are working on this project, and to give you a sense for how much this has grown. So I actually started this work as a first-year doc student, and now I think we're 5 years into it. And the initial team was, I think, 4 or 5 of us, with John Myers included. And actually, Dr. Sarah LaCour Yarbrough was one of the graduate students that was on the project as well. And now we have a team that spans multiple universities and organizations. And it's just been really nice to watch this work grow as the years have gone by. I'm also lucky today, as Dr. Dixon said, to present with some pretty brilliant folks. So John Myers, Regina Umpstead, and Kate Somerville, who will each highlight for you a different part of this part of the project. Okay, so in its simplest form, the Price of Opportunity project is about identifying and estimating the costs of programs and resources needed to close racial and socioeconomic opportunity gaps between students to ensure that all kids have access to high quality and free public education. So a good place to start for us is to ask, well, where do opportunity gaps come from, right? Or in other words, what factors explain the variation in student academic outcomes? If we think of policy or the decisions of politicians and policymakers as a proxy to answer this question, a lot of folks might believe that failing schools, right, quote unquote, failing schools are the problem. If we could only fix schools, then we would close opportunity gaps and achievement gaps. Those of you who study or are familiar with the effects of poverty and racism might say, well, you know what, maybe schools can't do it all. And obviously you'd be right. Studies examining variation in student outcomes find that differences in school quality explain only about 20 to 30% of the variation in student outcomes, which means that 70 to 80% of the variation in student outcomes is explained by factors outside of schools. So then you might think, well, okay, the fix is easy, right? Let's better fund schools and provide the out-of-school social and economic supports that students and families would need to be able to close opportunity gaps. And after being on this project for 5 years, I think the answer I would say is yes, you're right. And maybe it's not that simple, right? Because one of the things that we know is that even though we oftentimes know what we should do or what the smart thing to do, there's always politics involved. And more specifically, there's things like classism and racism that get in the way of us as a society developing a policy framework that is capable of closing educational opportunity gaps. So within this context, it's important to remember that part of the problem is that politicians have for some time rhetorically elevated schools as what they call, or what we use in this project, is as great equalizers, or mythological organizations that can magically somehow help students overcome life's worst obstacles. I'm sure you've all probably heard the saying, that you could make it, and all you need is a good education, right? You can just pull yourself up from your bootstraps. But while the term originated with the work of Horace Mann, who was an early advocate of universal public education, it's since become a rhetorical tool that allows politicians to center schools politically, but where politicians can do little to support schools financially or build the robust social and economic programs students and families need to address the out-of-school challenges they face. So this is just a few of the politicians who have done this, and over time, education has become a big issue in political politics, but oftentimes it's no more than that, right? Rhetoric of politicians centering schools. So what's unfolded is a policy strategy to close opportunity gaps that promotes school improvement efforts that don't directly address opportunity gaps, and a history of social and economic programs that should and could address opportunity gaps directly that have regressed over time. So there's a really great chapter in the Closing the Opportunity Gap book by Prudence Carter and Kevin Wellner that's written by Harvey Cantor and Rob Lowe, two historians. And they describe this process that they call the educationalizing of the welfare state. And really, it's the political centering of schools since the Great Society policies of Lyndon Johnson's presidential administration in the mid-1960s, and the regression of policies and turn towards neoliberalism and smaller government that we saw during the Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations that followed. And some would argue the Obama administration. So really what we have is a school system that is blamed when students' academic outcomes aren't closed, but that has not been designed to directly help children and families overcome the policies of systemic racism, economic exploitation, and public disinvestment. If anything, the system that we've created often reifies the hierarchies that exist in society. So even though this promise has been made, we've never really tried to create a school system that could really be the great equalizer. So what we tried to do with this part of the project is to bring into focus this idea of the great equalizer and really ask if our goal is to close opportunity gaps and to figure out how much that would cost, what are the different kinds of strategies that we can use? And this is just one of them, right? We could argue that maybe politicians should design and create a more robust social and economic system. But what we're saying is, let's assume that politicians are going to continue to do what they do and do nothing in those parts of society. And let's ask, well, okay, let's put our money where our mouth is and create these great equalizer schools that have so been promised, schools that can really overcome the out-of-school obstacles that students face, and also offers students high quality learning opportunities within schools. And that's really the research question driving this first part of the work. If pressed to realize the promise of the great equalizer, what would it take, or what would it look like, and what would be the price tag, right? So really identifying the resources and programs that we need in schools for them to both overcome the obstacles created by racism and poverty, and to be able to offer the high quality and enriching learning opportunities that they need to be able to succeed as students and in an economy and in their lives. So I'm going to hand it over to John Myers, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how our work builds on some past studies that have been done on costing out in school finance.
And as we look at the adequacy standards that we looked at, we need to go back and do a little history check on this. Really, Kentucky played a role in this because in June of 1989, the Supreme Court of Kentucky found that your school funding system was not constitutional. And a panel of consultants were brought in, and I happened to be the director of the education program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. So I was one of the panel of consultants that came in to talk to the legislature about how they would respond. And they responded in 1990 with CARA, which was the Kentucky Education Reform Act. And in it, they had some of the beginning looks at what do we mean by adequacy. And there have been some other court cases that have taken place before then, but basically that was one of the key standards for creating adequacy. There have been studies now that have used 4 different approaches in adequacy studies: successful schools, statistical modeling, evidence-based approaches, and professional judgment. Professional judgment is the one that is most similar to what we're using for the Price of Opportunity project. What we found out was that the adequacy studies that were being done in professional judgment rely on panels of proficient people that are out there in the country. So let's go on to the next slide. This is an important slide because it shows you where adequacy is. And so in the Kentucky version, you'd be down there in the gray slot at the very beginning before ECRI was passed. And then you step up to what I would call either slight or substantial equalization. Actually, the equalization was slight when you began, and by 2015, you'd moved into substantial equalization among school districts, but it was still way short of that pink box up there, which is the minimal adequacy. And minimal adequacy is defined really by these studies that have been done, and it's based on getting students to proficiency. And for those of you who know what that means, that just means that the proficiency is a basic level, and it doesn't address the issues of students that were high achievers or students that needed to go a long ways, because that's a really basic challenge. And so we'll move on to the next slide, but you'll see the latter is what's needed in order to get to our great equalizer. So that's where we've been working to try to identify what's needed from minimal adequacy to the great equalizer. So we move to the next slide. Our current reality is that school funding formulas are based primarily on state and local money, and most all local money is property taxes. And that means there's an inequality that's put into our places. And it's why we can safely say that schools with wealthy areas have higher property taxes, and so they have more money for their schools in most cases, and that those go to enrich out-of-school programs and more resources, where schools who have poorer areas have less resources and families that can't contribute as much, and therefore the policies fail to educate as well. So let's go to the next slide. And this is the slide that talks about the potential of the great equalizer, and that would be school-centric reforms. And as Chris has already pointed out, that's really a way for us to think about the ongoing history of discrimination and the policies that fail to educate everyone. So we need to create these school-centric reforms as to get to a great equalizer. But let's go to the next slide. So a public school system with resources and programs capable of overcoming systemic barriers inside and outside of schools. And a great equalizer system would provide students from all backgrounds educational opportunities, not to just proficiency in school tests, but in success in college, careers, citizenship, and in life. And next slide. And that I'll turn it over to Kate. No, Gina, I'm sorry.
Actually, yeah, this is my slide. Thanks, John. Nice overview. So step 2, we're going to do a state-by-state approach to account for variation across states, regions, and local communities. So this is where we've gone into states. We've done Colorado so far and are currently undertaking. Let's go to the next slide because I think it has it on there. North Carolina is undergoing right now. And we've also started work in Michigan for these states, and we haven't identified the additional states that we may collect data in, but we're trying to get a range of diverse states around the country so we can use them in a way as representative of certain regions of the country, but we also know that every state is different. So that is our plan right now in collecting the data. Next slide. So the state process is something that we go through, and our real question is, what does costing out the Great Equalizer look like in practice? And so we have a multiple stage approach that we take in each state as we collect data, and I'm going to talk to you, well, and Kate is also about this a little bit. There's more parts to this slide. Thank you. So this shows all of the steps in the process. And so as Chris and John talked about, is that we're really looking for a higher quality system of education that's not, it's better than the current system, it's better than adequacy. So it's really this idea of all students being successful in college, career, and life. And so what we want to do to figure out what that looks like is to have a real diverse pool of people from throughout the community, all the different regions, all the different communities that are represented in the state, and talk to people and find out what is it that the education system needs that it's missing. What does it have that's not only working well, but that's not working well, so that we can use that information and eventually take that to cost out what a Great Equalizer system of education looks like. So we start out with the statewide interviews in each state. So we've done this already in Colorado, North Carolina, and Michigan, where we talk to anywhere from 12 to 20 plus individuals who are experts around school finance and school issues in the state. And so we partner with a local group, and a lot of times there are networks throughout the state that have done that. So for instance, in North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Education Justice Coalition, and similar in Michigan, the Michigan Education Justice Coalition, and we work with them to help rally support in around the state for this project to find out what we can know from experts in the state around school finance. And so then the second part of this is the community meetings focus group. So we've done this in Colorado and North Carolina, and we work with our partners in the state to identify people that we need to talk to, and they actually organize regional meetings and talk to people in the communities. Because of COVID, some of that was done virtually, but some also is done in person. And so we'll go out and have a session with community members and talk about the current status of education funding and what they think communities need to better improve the education. And so in the first stage, we talked a lot to experts. In the second stage, we'd like to broaden it and talk to community members. So people who work in schools, people who are in the community, such as parents, even students, if we're able to, and gather that information. And so we have a team of researchers that look at that once we gather the information and identify trends and important issues. And then next we have our statewide panel, which is the stage we're at. We've done that in Colorado because we're complete in the work, and we're doing that in North Carolina now, where we're putting together invitations to people who are experts. And this panel is looking a lot at educators, parents, students, individuals with a lot of knowledge about the cost of education, in the sense of like, how many people do we really need to accomplish that? What are some things that are working and not working? How many more personnel might we need to accomplish this vision of a great equalizer opportunity? And all along, we're asking people to dream and think about what is possible with education in the state, not just what has been. And so that's going to come together. It can happen over the period of a day and a half or 2.5 days, where we have a series of questions that we ask and people are able to work collaboratively to come up with a list of priorities for the state that need to be addressed. And then finally, we have school finance experts on our own team, and we also partner with the states and look at, now that we have the list of priorities that the community in each state has given us, what did these cost? And that will take us a couple of months to do that. So we've done that in Colorado, and that's coming up in North Carolina. And obviously it will eventually happen in Michigan, probably later next year. Next slide. So step one, groundwork, is where we go in each state, and we really do a lot of research to understand the socio-political context, identify community and district partners, and this is where we identify individuals to work with. And you can see some of the organizations that we partnered with here in Colorado, like Colorado Education Association, Colorado PTA. And so these were some of the partners that were involved in the work in Colorado, and we have done the same thing in North Carolina and Michigan, of really finding people to work with who are passionate about this and who can really mobilize people in the state to participate in this process. And with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Kate.
Thank you, Gina. So I am going to talk a little bit about step 2, which are these regional meetings, which are essentially community meetings or focus groups in different parts of whatever state that we're working in. And where and who we engage are really informed by those interviews that Gina talked about, and by that groundwork phase where we're in partnership with other statewide organizations. So the goal of this part of the project is really to understand the interests of stakeholders across the state. So the number of meetings that we have will kind of depend on the size of the state that we're working in. For example, if we were in California, we would have a large number of community meetings to have. Rhode Island, we would probably have only a few. But we're really trying to understand the differences in stakeholder interests in different regions, different demographic areas, in areas with different educational backgrounds. So these meetings are really interactive, facilitated focus groups. Oftentimes we're talking to community groups about their concerns and what this research can do for them. And you can see in Colorado where we finished up our community meetings there. And then I think the next slide has a North Carolina map, which is what we wrapped up in the summer. And then we're currently planning this phase in Michigan. So kind of lots of different phases right now. We can go to the next slide. And then we get to our statewide panel, which is something that we are working on planning for North Carolina right now. So the statewide panel, we're really trying to get specific about the recommendations that people are giving us to cost out. So these panels are held over Zoom. In Colorado, it was, I think, a 3-day meeting. In North Carolina, we're going to do it in 2 days, hopefully. So we're aiming to get about 25 participants in this part of the process. And we're really looking for people who have varying levels of engagement and expertise with the school system. So looking for teachers, support personnel, parents, community members, all people who are experts in program and resource design. And we're really looking to address the inside and outside of school factors to reach this great equalizer system. So not only are we looking to provide high quality learning experiences, but also looking to overcome the impact of poverty and racism as much as we can inside of school. And the folks that sit on our statewide panels, we're really taking those recommendations from our partners and from interviews like Gina talked about. And our participants receive a conference stipend, which is really important to us. So that, yes, is awesome. And then next slide, please. Then we get to our outcomes. So our panelists are really identifying like the nitty-gritty design and programs and resources that we are going to cost out. In Colorado, this was over 100 resources and programs, so lots for our costing team to do. And then we divide these recommendations into major categories like teaching and learning, personnel, wellness, engagement, and facilities. And John is going to talk more about how we cost those resources out.
The costing out process really is done based upon the work of the panel. And the panel suggests numbers of, if we're talking about teacher meetings, if we're talking about special education programming, it's the number of people and the amount of salaries that should be paid to those people. That's the biggest piece of the costing out. And so we actually look at trying to find a number that is close to adequacy for the state. And then those 100 items that we just mentioned, that's what is added on to that level. So the next slide. And we do try to focus because there are a lot of programs and there are a lot of things you could make. And out of those 100, some of them didn't have a huge impact, but we certainly look to all of those items that are high cost estimates. Next slide. And well, there are state-specific data that we try to use to the costing list. And I think we've talked about that sufficiently so you have some idea of what's coming. So let's go on to the next slide. And this, I think I'm turning over to Chris, right?
That's right. Yeah, so I promised you at the end of the presentation that I would give a general overview of the project. So just a reminder, this is one part of the work that we're doing. And really, when I started our presentation, I talked a little bit about how there are multiple ways that as a society, we can think about addressing the issue of racial and socioeconomic opportunity gaps. We highlight the Great Equalizer strategy because it's what politicians have espoused now for decades. And really, it's a way for the work of the National Education Policy Center to call out that rhetorical promise that's never been fulfilled. It's a way of saying, you've promised these Great Equalizer schools now forever, and you've centered schools, and at the same time, you've failed to provide the supports that kids and their families need to be able to just have the minimum basic needs of life. And so what we really tried to do with the entirety of the project is to say, okay, there's this Great Equalizer side. We can make schools these amazing institutions that can do it all, that can do the teaching and learning, and that can address all of the out-of-school obstacles. And what we've done is identify two approaches to identify how we do that. One way is to say that the cost could be estimated by the, one second.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I'm in my office and someone gave it, but it's okay. So one way to do that is to do what we're doing here, to bring together a panel of educational experts who can identify what happens in schools and what it would take. The other way is to ask educational researchers who are experts in a number of different areas: curriculum, in teaching, in learning, in discipline and safety, and to ask them, how could we create this system? Alternatively, we could say, okay, well, let's not continue to burden schools in the same way. Ask them to do what they're supposed to be doing, teaching and learning. And then let's build a social welfare system that is going to be able to provide the kinds of supports that families need. And we've identified 2 approaches to do that as well. One is to examine the percentage of GDP spent in other OECD countries and to get a sense for what the US could spend. The other is to examine the estimated cost of research-based poverty interventions. So this is focusing more on the kinds of recommendations that have been made by the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities or other organizations, and then to compile that list and to say, okay, what would it cost to implement all of these policies? And again, just as a reminder, we only presented one part of this today, but we really are trying to think about what are the ways that we can do this. When we identify all of these ways and estimate these costs, which is going to be the most effective way to do it, which is going to be the most efficient way to do it. And what we think is that the best way to do this is some balance between the two, right? Is to better fund schools so that they have the resources that they need, so that we can eliminate the resource disparities that exist between schools and school districts, and also creating the social and economic system that we need to make sure that kids come to school and have what they need to be prepared and to be ready to learn and to thrive and flourish in life. And that's all we have for you. So if you ever want to know more about the project, you're welcome to email NEPC, or you can also go on the website nepc.colorado.edu, or you can follow NEPC on Twitter at NEPC Tweet.
Awesome. Thank you guys for a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And I was wondering, I may have missed this. So are you only thinking in terms of K-12? And if not, if it could be expanded beyond K-12, and I asked this question because I attended Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that's in the Southwestern Athletic Conference, the SWAC. And Deion Sanders is probably the most famous football coach now, who was formerly in the SWAC. And it's garnered a lot of conversation about his exit, and folks are divided. And so I just wondered, so there was the Twitter storm, folks, someone retweeted an article that came out in Forbes that talked about the amount of underfunding that land grant HBCUs, the disparity between land grant HBCUs and the PWI in their state, and this particularly in the South, and that it's in the billions. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking kind of like your argument for it sounds, kind of like how do we actually make schools a great equalizer if we fund it in this kind of really transformative way that matches our rhetoric, right? Could that extend? We could think about it. Could it extend to land grant universities that may not be kind of the flagship, or could we think about it as it relates to minority serving institutions? And would the process still need to be the same, even though we know kind of now we have a number? We know that there are several billions of dollars that are missing. Some before the 1980s, when there were decrees for the HBCUs and in the South to reach some sort of funding parity. But at any rate, I'm just wondering to what extent this could extend to higher ed and minority serving institutions that are determined to be land grant, which may be somewhat problematic because, it's a given there are land grants. But you can wait on my question. We have 3 questions in the Q&A, but if you want to go ahead, we can do that and then move to the Q&A. So I'm happy to defer.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say something, and then if the other panelists have anything to add. Dr. Dixon, it's as if you have been in our community meetings and in our statewide panels, because I think part of the challenge that we face in trying to estimate and conceptualize this great equalizer system is that folks will say, you know, what about early childhood ed? What about when a student has graduated? And so we're centering schools because of the rhetoric, but you're absolutely right that there are disparities that exist both in the antecedent, in what happens before students come to K-12, and then in what happens when they leave. And it's interesting because separate from this project, but some work that I'm doing here at Madison, there's a colleague of mine, Nick Hillman, who does higher ed finance, who just brought together a group of higher ed finance researchers to think about the very question that you posed. Is like, you know, we have all of these disparities within the higher ed system, and disparities that have been, that not only continue to grow, but that have been placed onto the backs of students, with student debt and the privatization of higher ed, and disproportionately on the backs of students of color, economically first gen students, who were just trying to gain access to like this promise of education. And what was interesting for me as a K-12 school finance researcher was to think, you know, a lot of these conversations we've had in K-12 haven't happened in higher ed, but are starting to happen. And you're absolutely right that there is a place to think about that the fact that we are now in a P20 educational system. Like you really do need a bachelor's degree to be able to participate in the economy, in the world in which we live. So yes, there is a need to do that and to have those conversations as well.
So we've got a few questions that have come in through the Q&A. And so I'll just go ahead and read off the first one, and then anyone can jump in and answer it. The first question is, when you talk about the different impacts, can you discuss more about how you judged what made an impact or not, and what your definition of impact is?
Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I could answer this. Yeah, I could answer this from a standpoint of the panel members. The definition of this is by the people that are in the panels for identifying how they would answer that question. So we're relying on participants, most of which should be practitioners.
Mm-hmm. And part of what we do when we're organizing our statewide panel is to prompt our practitioners and our panelists with thinking about sort of the context that we laid out during the presentation, and then also thinking about not only the kinds of recommendations that they would make based on their own experiences, but also, because we had all of these community convenings, thinking about how communities from across the state might think about which educational programs might be able to address the needs of their communities in particular. So if you think about communities that have a higher percentage of students with multilingual needs, or more racially diverse areas, or more economically disadvantaged areas. And so our panelists are both bringing their expertise to bear for what they think a great equalizer system would look like, while taking into consideration how their recommendations should vary given the different regional and community contexts that exist throughout a state.
We also have not commented about the researcher panel. And the question relative to higher education, as well as what you've just answered for what we provide to the community members. The researcher panel suggestions go a long ways to answer some of the higher education as it relates primarily to teacher education. But it would be rather dramatic. Some of the proposals were rather dramatic in how we would treat potential teachers at the university. or land grant institutions, any one of them.
Yeah.
So there's a follow-up to that question that just came through. It says, so how do you keep that definition of impact consistent in order to be able to share more generalizations? Or is it more interested in state-only implications?
That's a great question. Yeah, part of the challenge in the US is that we have a decentralized system of public education. And so we have every state, Kentucky, Kansas, California, Texas, each making decisions, as John described earlier, about what proficiency means, right? So there was this whole history of adequacy studies, and which Gina can speak to more, about determining what the duty of each state was to their students. And I'll just say what we're trying to do by doing state level panels is to be thoughtful about the fact that each state has the system that where they can design their own public education or their own school system, but also to think about it in the sense of public education is a national project, right? It is the goal of the United States to have a educated citizenry and to make sure that those opportunities are equitably and justly offered to students. And so part of what we try to do is not necessarily to generalize the standard across states to say, well, the Great Equalizer standard needs to be the same in Kansas as it is in Kentucky, as it is in, and all the programs and recommendations need to be exactly the same. But to say, what did California recommend relative to what Colorado recommended, and how can we learn across states about what panelists and practitioners and communities are recommending to create this system, to create a robust list of programs and resources.
Anyone else? I can move on to the next question as well. So there's a question here just about more asking to go a little bit more in depth about the recruitment of participants in focus groups and panels, and how you go about ensuring a wide selection of voices in these studies.
I can start with this one because this is currently what I'm doing in North Carolina. So I think that for this part of the process, we really lean on our community partners because we recognize that we will not be experts in an educational context in whatever state we're working in. So we've really leaned on our community partner in North Carolina to kind of guide us in terms of where we should be having community meetings. So we spent time in North Carolina over the summer. We had 5 community meetings. And then the data from those community meetings is informing the topics that we're going to be talking about at our state panel, which is coming up. And after we kind of figure out what the topics should be, then we go back to our community partner and ensure that we have people on the panel from different geographic regions, with different racial and ethnic identities, with different areas of expertise. We have like kind of a list of people that we want to make sure are on that panel. Like I'm trying to find 2 youth to sit on the panel, for example. So if anyone else wants to jump in.
I think also our partners are definitely the most important part of being able to identify individuals. And so they help us identify individuals initially. And then when we do the interviews, we also ask typically, you know, who else would you recommend? And then we would bring that name to the partners and say, you know, this name is coming up frequently, or is this somebody that, you know, might be good to, you know, for different parts of the project that may have expertise that we need to, you know, a voice that we need to hear in doing that. So that has been another helpful way, but we definitely, I mean, we run that all through partners and say, here it is, please guide us.
And I think it's also important to acknowledge that every state context is going to be a little bit different. So like in North Carolina, you have the Leandro case, and that's going to be like kind of a focus in the state panel. So we definitely need to pay attention to the different contexts. Like, for example, if you had a state with like very robust early childhood education resources, it's going to look different. The panel is for a state that doesn't have those resources. So.
And I think the personal relationships matter too. So usually we'll talk about, who, if we have certain names, does anyone know that person? So that we can reach out with it's not a completely cold ask that you at least know this person to do it. But I mean, we also have people that we don't know on the panels and giving us information that we are able to collect and add to the collective wisdom.
Thank you so much. So I think we have one more question, and then we'll go ahead and close at the top of the hour and give folks some time back. But this question I think is a really important one, especially for our student teachers, pre-service teachers who might be tuning in. So at what point does removing standardized testing as one of the solution, so that schools and districts can focus less on the test scores? Or how do we change the narrative around test scores? In all my work, the barrier and excuse has always been around testing.
Who wants to jump in first?
Just a small question for the end.
That's right. It's a great question.
Well, it's interesting. Let me just start. I'm sure other people have a lot of opinions. It's interesting because in at least the interviews that I've conducted and that I've read, people are not talking about test scores. I mean, we've talked with superintendents of education. We've talked to legislators, and they're talking really more about student success and in terms of being ready for college, career, and life. They're not talking about a test score per se and how that's measured. And they're thinking more broadly about students and what they need than just that one measure.
Yeah, I'll add, it's interesting because our work is sort of framed as what is the additional cost of creating this system? But I think sometimes what we've heard from our participants, both at the community level and at the statewide panel, is that, there are things that we need, and those additional things will require more money. But there are a lot of things that we can think about in schools that it costs nothing. If anything, we can save money by abolishing them or changing them dramatically. One is the system of high stakes accountability that we have in the US. The other is things like how we do discipline and safety. If you think about spending on school police and things like that, participants will often say, well, we don't need any more money to just get rid of SROs in schools or police in schools. That's, if anything, a cost saving change. And so it's interesting, right? We often think about the additional money that we need, but oftentimes there are things that we can do away with. And Kate, I'm curious, maybe there's some things you want to talk about in terms of like the environmental and health outcomes that exist around schools, in terms of like the ways that people think about that and how we can think about pollution and things like that.
Yeah, and I think this kind of fits into what approach number is it? 3, 4?
3.
One of the other ones. But yeah, I think that one good example is like if we're thinking about putting a lot of money into school-based health centers, for example, also considering how we're preventing those health issues from happening in schools. So like we can put a lot of money towards treating asthma, for example, in schools, but we could also put some money towards the environmental racism that causes disproportionate amounts or in instances of people having asthma in certain communities. So I think that this kind of goes back to this question as like these really big societal problems that are kind of being addressed in schools, but thinking about where we're putting the money and at what level we're intervening on things like that. It's important.
All right, thank you so much. Does anyone have any closing thoughts or any last things you want to let the audience know before we close out for the evening? I'll just leave it open for a moment.
Just say thank you again to you, Mariama, and Dr. Dixon, and Dr. LaCour Yarborough for inviting us.
Yes,
This
thank
is
you
really
all.
exciting. Thank you. We're so excited. I'm sorry, Mariama, I didn't mean to cut you off. Really exciting work, a lot to think about. Excited to hear as a methodologist, I'm really interested in hearing more about the what happens when you're ready to kind of write up the bigger piece of it, the methodology. It's a lot of pieces, but it's really important work and iterative, it looks like. And so we appreciate you all taking the time to join us and to share your work and to help us to imagine schools in a different way. We always talk about kind of how can we do school differently. And I think the finance piece, we rarely think outside of the structure that we always have, that we're in. And it just has come kind of common sense that we're stuck with the way that we fund schools. But I think the work is exciting, and I hope that it gets a lot of traction when you all are ready to kind of give it some, bring it to prime time. So thank you. Please follow us on Twitter, UKY Civil Rights, Instagram, UKY Civil Rights, and our website. Again, we host the webinars every Thursday, or not every Thursday, one Thursday, what is this? Whatever Thursday this is of the month. Is this the first? The second Thursday.
Second Thursday.
The second Thursday of the month from 6 to 7:30. So I had to do the time transition in my head. I want to make sure I was saying the right thing. Again, I'm Adrienne Dixon, Executive Director of the Education and Civil Rights Initiative. And Mariama Lockington has held us all together, and we're very appreciative to have her here, making us look pretty. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.